In January 2026, another severe bushfire tore through the last remaining stronghold of the Western Ground Parrot, or Kyloring as it's known by Noongar people of southwestern Australia. With only around 150 individuals in existence, this is a potentially devastating occurrence.
So the Western Ground Parrot is critically endangered, and Cape Arid National Park is the only remaining wild population, with a little bit of habitat extending into Neutzland Nature Reserve just to the east of Cape Arid. On the 16th of January this year, we had some extensive lightning along the south coast, and a lightning strike ignited a fire out near Poison Creek. And that fire was fanned by a fairly strong southwesterly wind and ended up burning through around 13,000 hectares in the core Kyloring habitat very quickly.
Regional ecologist Dr. Sarah Comer and the DBCA project team, with support from perennial volunteer Jim Crichton, have come to assess the habitat damage, the impact on the Kyloring population, and continue working to protect any of these endangered parrots that have managed to fly away from the fire. Kyloring is particularly difficult to monitor. With its cryptic plumage and ground-dwelling nature, the bird is rarely seen. Instead, monitoring relies on detecting birds calling as they fly between roosting and feeding areas in the low-light pre-dawn and post-sunset periods. After a fire, feral cats and foxes take advantage of the limited cover in burnt bush to predate on vulnerable animals. The team must find out where the surviving parrots have flown to by checking data from an array of acoustic monitoring units spread throughout their habitat. This monitoring provides the team with estimates of Kyloring occupancy over a large landscape and allows them to monitor population trends over time.
And they're spread over around 60,000 hectares of potential unoccupied Kyloring habitat. We'll process all that data back in the office next month, and fingers crossed we'll find some activity where we haven't had activity recently.
Some of the units were burnt in the fire. These recording units capture thousands of hours of audio, creating a massive amount of data that needs to be analysed. Currently, the analysis is done manually. It's time-consuming and challenging to use modern machine learning methods to process, with the call of the tawny crown honeyeater often mistaken by the machine as a ground parrot. The need to process manually means DBCA staff don't have as much time to complete other critical activities, and there's only time to analyse a proportion of the data collected. But PhD student Joseph Janke is doing a study that could revolutionise how the backlog of data is processed and also yield new information critical to the life and therefore management of Kyloring.
The standard survey techniques just don't work for this species. There are lots of other species, even endangered ones, where you can get eyes on them, you know exactly where they are, in how many there are, the sexes of the animals. But for a species like this, all that is just impossible.
Joseph is building some artificial intelligence or machine learning models that help with the heavy lifting required to process the hours of data collected by the DBCA team. Once his models have been tested, they can be used to retrospectively analyse historic data that hasn't been yet, and will also be compared against data processed by humans. Joseph is also mapping out the exact structure of the Western Ground Parrot's calls, or their vocal repertoire, translating their complex language.
It's so complex, the repertoire for this species. One really amazing thing that I'd like to do with that is to be able to use my study of the repertoire to understand how the bird encodes information in the way it calls.
By training AI to recognise Kyloring calls, The DBCA team won't just save time processing the song files from the monitoring units, they might unlock secrets hidden within the audio. If the work on the repertoire finds they can tell males from females and juvenile calls, it changes everything.
Males and females make different calls in this species. There does seem to be some kind of frequency differentiation, so males will call at a slightly different frequency than females.
Additionally, by analysing the timing of calls arriving at an array of monitoring units, Joseph hopes to triangulate the birds' exact locations.
Localization is one really interesting piece of technology where we can kind of triangulate calls, where you can estimate density of animals purely by recording their vocalization. And that would unlock a totally different way for us to model density and abundance and population trends for this species.
In a vast landscape threatened by fires and feral predators, knowing exactly where these surviving parrots have moved to is critical.
This park is huge, and so it's quite difficult to decide when and where to coordinate your management. And so if we can understand which are the most important areas of the park for this species, then we can be more specific with the way that we conserve the park and manage them.
We're also doing our second feral cat trapping run for the year, just following up on the baiting after the fire. So there was an aerial bait delivered immediately after the fire, and we're just following up on that and taking out any animals that have survived the baiting. This trip we've caught 3, all females, so fairly low levels of activity, but that's what we would hope for after a baiting program. Before the baiting we took out 12, so there's definitely some good positive signs that this extra effort's making a difference. What we're trying to do is actually make sure that we're minimising the predation pressure on the birds that remain, and also being aware that, you know, at that time of year in January there's quite likely lots of younger birds on the ground that may be quite naive and vulnerable to predation. Fire at the wrong time and the wrong place and the wrong size, so the fire regime can be a huge threat. But small fires that stimulate seeding plants are actually really positive for parrots, and we know that they'll actually use recently burnt country to feed in, but they do need the long unburnt refuges for roosting and breeding. You know, what we don't want is big landscape scale fires, and you know, this one's certainly fairly significant and impacting about 1/3 of the core area that we know is occupied by ground parrots.
In 2015, a devastating fire burnt 90% of the parrot's habitat, and the team have been working hard over the past decade to help the parrots and their habitat recover.
In spite of those fires, the populations continued to be relatively stable, so they obviously have some capacity to move into unburnt refuges. So the key thing now is protecting those, and the synergistic threat of introduced predators, you know, managing that at the same time.
Between 2021 and 2023, the team caught a small number of birds, which were moved to another carefully prepared site in a trial translocation, attempting to establish a new wild population.
The fact that the birds persisted and there was evidence of breeding suggests that, you know, we can actually re-establish birds in that area. We need to identify a second translocation site. That's fairly important.
In 2009, the first ground parrots were taken into human care on the south coast to see if they could be the foundation of a captive breeding program. In 2013, these birds were transferred to Perth Zoo.
Preparing his vocal cords. Oh yeah.
That's a good one.
Since then, the zoo team have put in an immense amount of effort and endured several crushing blows. But finally, a historic milestone has been reached.
It feels fantastic to have a Western Ground Parrot chick. We've been working at this for over a decade now, learning as much as we can about the species and how to get them to reproduce. It definitely renewed our hope in the program. Obviously working for over 10 years to achieve this outcome can get, it can take its toll. It gets stressful at times, especially when things don't go the way that you'd like them to go. But then to produce a chick, see it thrive and it actually do so well has really, really boosted morale.
The fact that the chick is a female has significantly improved the potential breeding outcomes for the program.
So we're learning lots of different things, seeing lots of different behaviours between a chick and its parents. We're hoping that everything that we learn can help to save Western Ground Parrots in the wild.
The potential for the zoo population to actually support conservation in the wild is significant. It's a bit of pressure to put on them just having cracked one fledgling, but I think that the learnings from that work are really significant for conservation.
Securing the future for Kyloring relies on a network of strategies and partnerships and sources of funding from many supporting organisations, including the Australian Government, BirdLife Australia, South Coast NRM and the Friends of the Western Ground Parrot. The DBCA team has adapted their monitoring methods over the years, pushing boundaries to understand and conserve this elusive bird. Soon, with the help of AI, monitoring data will be processed more efficiently, allowing them to track the parrots more effectively and eventually in near real time. The team will continue to be vigilant in the face of emerging threats, with the recent detection of H5 bird flu on the south coast, a potential risk to this last wild population.
It's that constant flexibility and adapting to new technologies and new learnings and working with a really passionate, committed team and continuing to build on partnerships and expertise with researchers, with First Nations people, working with the ranger groups across the region in understanding and conserving the species is just a wonderful direction to be heading. The work of Perth Zoo and the Friends of the Western Ground Parrot and all of the partnerships and the awareness, there really is hope that we can, one day achieve our vision of the ground parrot heralding the start of every day across habitat on the south coast.